Hi, this is Dewerff with Equip School of Discipleship, talking about church history. This is the part 2. Picking up from where we left off, there was the first class we talked about from the different ages of the church, and how starting with the apostles and then going through the period after the apostles, and while the church was expanding and growing but still under persecution, and then how it entered the empire phase of being endorsed and spreading in the Roman Empire. And we just barely got into the Christian Middle Ages, and I think we talked about a little bit about even the rise of Islam in that segment. And in the class, we talked about how the status of the church kind of at right around 1054 is where the big division happens between the East and the West that kind of finally cements things. So right around, we'll say 1000 AD, we have a Western church and we have an Eastern church, and there's also the branches of the church that are in the kind of the Middle East and even down in Africa that have split off based on one of the differences that was discussed in the councils, which led to the differences with the Coptic church in Egypt. And so we're going to talk today about picking up where kind of leading up to the age of the Reformation. And the date for that we have down is 1517. And that date is remarkable because that is when Martin Luther posted his 95 theses or propositions to the door, and kind of started that the discussion of that led to him being excommunicated and breaking away and starting a new thing in the church. So during this age of the Reformation, there is we call it a spirit of reform that breaks out. The church in the Western church ends up being 4 major traditions that come out of the Roman church of early Protestantism. We'll talk about Luther, and then the Reformed tradition, and Anabaptist and Anglican. So starting with Martin Luther, he one of the things that's interesting in this period is how, and even previous, is how many of the reform movements, but I'm not even talking about the big R reform, but like how many of them come from priests and even from the scholars of once they got their hands on and studying Scripture itself. And that happened with Martin Luther. He was he started off as a monk, and then became a scholar and began preaching, and also a role as a pastor of taking care of people. But all of what he did was within the Catholic Church of the time. He had these, even the 95 theses. There were really there were issues that he had a problem with, and he posted them as also like as topics for theological debate. They're things he wanted to talk about and discuss, and he was hoping originally for reform and of the Catholic Church, not something different, but just to help kind of do away with the excesses and the problems that he saw at the time. One of the main things that spurred him on too was at that time they had got to the selling of indulgences and a way of trying to raise money through that at the time. So and that kind of fired him up and got him sent him on his path. And one of the things that really stood out to him as he was reading the early scriptures was, and what we know him for is that his argument that salvation was by faith alone. And he also said that the scriptures and not popes or councils are the standard for Christian faith and behavior. I talked a little bit about how even, just in a couple 100 years before, well, like 100 years before, really, with Wycliffe and John Hus, how they were, some of their efforts of translating the Bible into their own language, so translating into English, and and Martin Luther does the same with translating into German. There was another scholar of the time, Erasmus, who was doing a new translation in Greek, and of the Greek New Testament, but Martin Luther translates the Bible into German at this time. And also this period, the first really 50 years, the period of 25 to 50 years here, not only do you have Martin Luther, who leads this charge, there's also John Calvin, who comes out of France, and who is a scholar, and he ends up having to leave France because of being just the critiquing of the church there, but they also in 1534 you have the Church of England gets established and has a break from the Church of Rome. Also have the birth of the Anabaptists and all these movements. All this takes place right in this first 50 years. I mean, there was plenty leading up to it, and then it continues on, but there was definitely a move going on at this time. And some of the four main questions that are asked, the Protestants were asking, and that kind of define the differences between where the church was and where part of it is going, is the question of how is a person saved, and where does a religious authority lie, what is the church, and what is the essence of Christian living. And these are all topics that where there becomes debate and then a different way of moving forward. So and a lot of these, again, a lot of the protests or calls for reform were initially trying to shine a light on the status of the church at the time and wanting the church to change, not trying to start something new or different. And that was kind of more of the end result. And there were, even in the same period, there were calls from within the Roman Church as well of pointing out their errors, the ways they've realizing that they become really involved in secularism and seeking power, and and so they will have their own. Sometimes it's called a counter-reformation or a revival, and that happens kind of in response. Some of that was already beginning to happen as well. But yeah, so the 16th century was there was a lot going on in the church. One of the things with the Anabaptists, they were called Anabaptists more by their critics than themselves. Anabaptists really just meant a rebaptizer, but for them it wasn't even about baptism. It was more of the issue of the nature of the church and its relation to civil government. So as we've talked about, once the church and the state became combined, and kind of the strive for bringing a Christendom, having the nation that is ruled by the church, that there's the theme through history of, once the church is established, of that, people longing for that and trying to build that, and then realizing their fall, how it falls short once it gets entwined. Kind of trying to make bringing what's supposed to happen in the future to now. And so that's where, a lot of these problems have come from. And the Anabaptists were really wanting to see the separation of the church and the state, or their civil governments. And they were also pointed out they wanted to shape society by their example of radical discipleship, of being kind of calling back to living a different way, and that if you were a follower of Christ, that it should compel you to live in a way that was different than the culture around you, especially at this time. And then in England and Scotland as well, but in England, right at the same time too, there's a break. The break in England has more to do with politics actually than with doctrinal issues. A lot of it had to do more with the king at the time. He was looking for a male heir, and he wasn't getting it from his wife, so he wanted to have his marriage annulled so that he could remarry, so that he could produce a male heir. And the Pope would not allow it, and he eventually just decides to make that break and say I'm gonna, makes himself the head of the Church of England, and that continues to be the way it is now. The current Queen is still the head of the church, as far as I understand, and so that their break from Rome, nothing really changed except for that the monarch was the head of the church instead of the Pope or a bishop who reported to the Pope. So so they developed their own national church. The services, or their masses, everything stayed the same. There were two slight changes that happened, kind of, and again, the first one was more political. There was a suppression of the monasteries, where he closed half of the monasteries. He thought there were too many, and part of it was to also grab kind of a land grab to gain the property and the finances from that. And but then also there was he ordered the publication of the English Bible for use in the churches. And there had been some translation of the scriptures into local languages, but it wasn't widespread. as what starts to happen in this time. Yeah, so from that point on, we got so we have the Anglican Church, which remains, and right here in 1540, I have down that is also when Ignatius Loyola founded, well, in 1540 was really whenever it was the Society of Jesus, known as the Jesuits. It's when it was endorsed by the Pope. So it actually kind of started just a little before there, but they play an important part in history. They were kind of known as soldiers of Jesus. They kind of were responsible for bringing about kind of a militant stance to the church at this time again, but especially they had an ethos of scholasticism and becoming missionaries, and that went out to the wider world. So this is also the period where in the 1500s, when the explorers were going to what is now Central and South America, and the Jesuits were the missionaries that were going along with them at this time. The part of also this, when we say the Roman Church at this time, their counter-reformation is there's a revival of piety, and this is also the period where the Roman Inquisition starts, and they also develop an index of prohibited books, which included any of the Protestant writings, any of the English translation of the Bible, and that list of banned books continued until the 1900s. But if you were caught with those, you were you're in big trouble. So I'm not going to really talk about the Council of Trent. This period of Reformation has going till 1648, because at the end of 1648 is the end of the 30 Years' War, and this happens mainly in Germany. It's the Peace of Westphalia, where the Protestants and Catholics had been fighting during this 30 years. But at the peace, there emerged that they could go ahead, and they kind of fought it out enough where neither side was winning, and so they're going to be able to exist in the same territory, and the emerging nation states would require Christians to live under a government whose citizens belong to a variety of denominations of faith. And that's one of the things that's kind of remarkable after that point, is how from this point on you have more of kind of realizing that it's not going to be all or nothing. There's going to be coexistence, and let's see, I was also going to say something else about this period. I think I was going to talk a little bit about John Calvin. One of the things about Calvin's approach was that it spread throughout much of Northern Europe as well, and it wasn't always a separate thing. But it becomes like, especially in Scotland, it becomes one of their shapes their beliefs, and there's a lot more to say about that, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to this next part. Is 1648 begins the age of reason and revival. And again, all these ages, they overlap, in history, things things build up over time. But this period is where, secularly, we refer, it's talked about the Renaissance, and kind of the Enlightenment happens during this period. So this was part of as the growth of science, people start to challenge and push back on even believing in kind of a denial of a supernatural religion, and so that becomes the challenge for the church, and a change for the Protestant part is that this is where we see the growth of revivals. So in Germany, we have Pietism is a movement that this is where the Moravians come from in this time, and it's unique in that this is where we start to see the stress of importance of personal faith, and a move away from, again, the idea of a Christendom, caring less about state affairs, whereas Martin Luther was really tied to still the idea of the state. And that's kind of the hallmark even through, well, I don't know about currently, but I know it's all the way through the Second World War, is that the German state and the princes of Germany previously were, they were kind of in charge of what was preached, who was put in those positions, and all that. So here in the revival age, it becomes again more about your personal experiences. The essence of the faith is experience of God's grace in the believer's heart. Again, this is from Pietism, and they wanted to shift the center of Christian life from state churches to intimate fellowships. There was the legacy of an emphasis on small groups and devotional reading of Scripture. That was one of the things they developed during this period. And John Wesley, who was in the Anglican Church, he was he had an encounter with the Moravians and saw their kind of their passion and their spirituality, and that is one of the things that intrigued him and prompted him to kind of change it, or have an encounter that changed the way that he preached. He was, I believe, at Oxford, and he had developed, him and some of his friends had developed the method of having small meetings, of sharing testimonies, prayers, spiritual encouragement, and this was all what we would now call like having your life group or your small groups in addition to your going and having a Sunday service. He started this, and again, as part of being in the Anglican Church, but him and George Whitefield, they found their ministry explode whenever they started doing open air preaching, going on and preaching to the masses, preaching to people in fields, going to where they were at, and also it happens, we get in the 1740s to the 1760s, where you start to have the Great Awakening in the Americas, in the colonies, where, and John Edwards had been up in New England and had been starting this. He was a forerunner of this as well, but there starts to be a wave of of revival that goes through, and it's more becomes a kind of an experiential happening, and so it gets away from as much of the, I think, kind of the knowledge, or even so you could say in the Age of Reformation, there's kind of the scholastic debates, a lot of it in, and then in the next age we get to the revival. It's more about there's kind of the lasting part of it is that there's more of a personal experience instead of just the a doctrinal and some of the ideas. Yeah. Okay, and then the age after that, we would say would be the age of progress. Now, in this period, you see is obviously where 1789 to 1914, which is where even on the state level there starts to be revolutions. Obviously, the colonies have a revolution away from the American colonies, away from from England. And 1789 is marked because it's the storming of the Bastille, which kicks off the French Revolution, which it kind of changes things in Europe, because it's the end of starts a kind of the ball rolling of monarchies falling. One of the characters or people I marked down for this period was William Carey. In 1792 is when he formed the Baptist Missionary Society, and he's the one who had been a shoemaker, but he also loved the classics, and he studied Latin and Greek in his own time, but he was compelled and felt called to and develop that, the push for developing or wanting to evangelize whole continents. And whereas previous, some of the missionaries, as they would go around and kind of, people have always had a hard time when they talking about the way they do church or the way they fellowship, or especially missionaries, as they would go historically, they would not just take Christ with them, they would take their culture, and a lot of it wouldn't necessarily be the same. So William Carey is noted for recognizing that Christianity must be firmly rooted in the culture and traditions of the land in which it's planted. That also becomes a thing for the Jesuits, not maybe not initially, but it's really by the time they get to Japan, they kind of have the same realization, or and start to change their approach to embrace the way Paul did of integrating the gospel in the Christian life into the culture where it can be, and it's kind of finding truth and beauty, and lifting that up and peeling away the rest. So but yeah, this age, definitely the age of progress, is marked by a global growth of missionary movement, and unlike earlier missionary expansion led by monks, bishops, the everyman started to create societies, and they were organized on the widest base possible. humanitarian ministries accompany the widespread preaching of the gospel too. And so even as they start going into even in Africa, and oh man, I just blanked on his name, but as a preparation for going to share the gospel in Africa, David Livingstone, gee, Merry Christmas, sorry, he gets trained as a doctor, and which is one of the things we see now. He gets training as a doctor so that he can be able to help the body and the soul as he goes across. And it's also where the church kind of is a big part of challenging slavery. Obviously, William Wilberforce in England, and yeah, David Livingstone as well had spoke out against slavery and what he saw going on in Africa. That's from this period. And then the last one would be for from usually referred to as the Age of Ideologies, which would be from 1914 to the current day. And that's 1914 is the start of the First World War. At the time, they called it the Great War. It was, even historically, there's everything that's going on at the time. There's a huge change from 1914 and then moving forward, because it's kind of the end of a lot of monarchies at that time, and it's obviously the first, what they thought of as a global war, but to have that many people die in fighting, it was kind of, it also created another revival, another spiritual awakening, and people questioning things. And so, but obviously, I have down here that we also see these rise of other ideologies of, communism, Nazism, Americanism, the rights of individuals. Yeah, and so we're still left today with some of these. I think even the questions of that started Protestantism are ones we still ask and trying to figure out how to move forward. And I think our fight more now is against secularism and even atheism, and trying to figure out not being able to speak the same languages. So I hope I don't have as many names and dates on this second part as I did on the first. Hopefully that's not or that's encouraging to some, or we can talk more about it in the next class, and hope this helps. Thanks.